Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Knocked Conscious. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Ariela Moscowitz. She's the Director of Communications for Decriminalize Sex Work at decriminalizesex.work. It was a very interesting conversation. We talked about a lot of topics. I learned a lot about the topic as a whole. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. Hi everybody. I have Ariela Moscowitz with me. She is the Director of Communications with Decriminalize Sex Work. The website is decriminalizesex.work. Ariela, welcome to Knocked Conscious. I met your team at Freedom Fest this year, but I understand you were not there, so we did not cross paths. Tell me about yourself. Welcome. I'd love to hear about everything. So start it where you'd like to
Okay.
start, and we'll certainly have a great conversation about it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Well, I'm thrilled to finally meet you. I heard wonderful things from my coworkers and colleagues who were at Freedom Fest. A great, conference every year. We have a presence. As I was saying, I got to go for 2 years. I went to my first Freedom Fest was in South Dakota. It was the first convening, in South Dakota had fewest restrictions. I did get COVID that trip for the first time. But then we returned to Vegas in all our glory. And I, made it to Mount Rushmore on that trip, things I never thought I would get to do.
Did you go
I
to
mean,
the Vegas one in the Mirage 2 years ago?
yes, it must have been at the
Okay.
Mirage. Were you there?
That's actually my first Freedom Fest experiences.
Oh,
I was actually with
okay.
my girlfriend having dinner at Calicchio's at the Mirage. We weren't even planning.
Oh, it was a
And
great
all of a sudden,
restaurant.
like Steve Forbes walked by. And I'm like, what the heck Steve Forbes doing? And then I looked up and like all the signage. And I looked at her and I said, I'm going to be here in 2 years. And then I got media credentials. So I was really happy. So
Nice. You made it
decriminalize
happen.
sex work. I watched the podcast yours. I understand that you have never been part of the sex work field. Is that correct? You were never been a sex worker?
Um, I will just point out, it is a lot to ask somebody, kind of publicly whether or not they have been a sex worker. I'm perfectly comfortable answering that I don't have lived experience as a sex worker. The ways
And the
my
only reason I ask, I
experiences.
apologize. I only asked that because I saw it on the other podcast and you had
Yeah,
spoken with
yeah, no, and
Bart
I've
about it. So
gotten better
I
at.
would not normally do it in this way. And I apologize if I came
You
across,
don't need to
I want to be
apologize. I
sensitive to that.
I could tell that you were somebody who could be receptive to what I was about to tell you, which, it because of stigmatization and criminalization and the reasons we are here to talk about these issues, it's a really difficult thing to ask someone. But I'm glad you asked. We were talking about Freedom Fest in South Dakota. The decriminalization of consensual adult sex work kind of goes hand in hand with um, putting the fewest restrictions possible on people's lives and kind of accepting where we are in reality and not forcing people to conform to theories and outdated notions of ideology and morality that we have. So, a lot of words to say, um, that the decriminalization of consensual adult sex work is one of the most common sense, vital harm reduction measures I can think of. We'll just start at the top. Um, Sex work is not inherently exploitative or dangerous. It is the criminalization and the stigmatization of it, which go hand in hand, that make it dangerous. Because our society criminalizes sex work and therefore the individuals engaged in it, they are pushed to the margins where they're vulnerable, where we put them, where we make them vulnerable. And then we say, hey, look at your bad choices. Look what you did.
Right.
And we're gonna fix it by arresting you. Um,
Right.
and that goes both for the sex worker themselves and for the buyer. And we can go into all the different theories, around this regarding policies. But the bottom line is that the decriminalization of consensual adult sex work is how we can best eliminate violence and exploitation in the sex trade. Right now, as we get into a policy discussion, you'll hear about how a lot of we call it the establishment anti-trafficking movement, which are a number of organizations involved in spreading a moral panic, right, around what trafficking is. Spoiler alert, they're wrong. And their inability to see the reality of the world, aside from the lens they would like to see it through, is putting the very people they are saying they want to help in further danger. I'll let you ask me a question there, and then I can kind of go back to the beginning a little
Yeah.
bit.
Well, and that was perfect. Yes, and I would love to go to the beginning. So this is the thing. The reason I ask these types of questions is what I find interesting is I if you can show your work, if people can show me how they got to where they got, whether it's through that personal experience or something, that is how I think we're able to show others so that they can have a different perspective. A lot of
Absolutely.
these a lot of these back and forths are like, no, you're wrong. No, you're right. No, you're wrong. And it's not about this. Okay, you have this. This is your stance. Decriminalize sex work. Now, you just told me all of these things about it. Now, that obviously comes from experience, from data you research. So I'd love to hear, wind it back to like how you first came across this, how this touched you, like your heart,
Yeah.
obviously, because
Yeah.
you clearly have compassion and want to help.
Thank you
That's
for
your
that
intent.
question. I'll just stop and say quickly here. For the most part, the voices that we want to put forward are people who themselves, have been engaged in sex work or who have been victims of exploitation and trafficking. Those are the two groups. There's a lot more crossover than people like to think about. Um, but I do these kind of big, general, broad discussions where I can lay out some of the theory and kind of the zoomed out view, because I am the one sitting in the dark somewhere reading lots of research and writing about it. But I'll tell you
Yeah, you have to
how this.
communicate. I hear that's part of your work. So
Yeah, I do communicate professionally. I talk a lot. You may have already become aware of this. So, but yeah, as I said, by the time it gets to be 7:30, I've done a lot of talking for the day already. But I'll try to zoom in quickly on how this became an issue on my radar. Because really, I can only speak to my experience. So I always grew up involved in social justice. My parents were both attorneys. That was something they instilled in us, that when you have the opportunity to give back, to lift another one up, when you have that free time in your space and in your mind and in your life, you do what you can. So it's always geared kind of towards a helping profession. I'm also an older, I'm a first daughter, so there's lots of stuff there. But I
all the
graduated
pressure.
college.
I can't imagine.
I graduated college with a um, major in psychology and a minor in women's studies. I'm old enough that it was women's studies and not gender studies. And throughout my years in high school and during college, I volunteered nonstop in domestic violence shelters and in homeless shelters for men, women, children, and anyone needing assistance. My first job after college, I moved to Philadelphia, and my first job was in a court mandated drug rehab program. So people would, accept a reduced sentence in exchange for attending mandatory treatment. Another thing I kind of thought sounded great at the outset, as we all know, we when we know better, we do better. And my work there led me to a wonderful organization called People's Emergency Center in Philadelphia. I don't, you said you're from there. It's a wonderful community development organization and place for unhoused women and children to land. And I spent a couple years working with families in West Philadelphia. And my office was in an apartment building in West Philadelphia. So I was in these families' lives, and my job was to connect them to services as much as possible. As they, some of them had jobs and lost them. There were various reasons people had ended up, in the shelter, and then transitional housing, and then emergency housing. It became very clear to me very quickly, and all these things are crystallizing, that the systems we force people to operate within in this system, in this country, are, you know, it's the fancy words we have for structural violence, systemic violence. We set people up to fail, and then we punish them when they do. So
Yeah,
I
we talk about government, like government creates, solves the problem that it initially creates through these weird things. It's crazy
well,
because a buddy of mine says no one's born a libertarian, and that's so true because you speak to that point. Is sex work is a private act that literally is a consensual agreement between whoever's involved, and that has no bearing, does not affect anyone else besides those people in that agreement.
correct. But well, I'll
Very
explain to you
simple.
why people think it does. You know, and also we try to legislate morality all the time. The issue with this is not only is the quote unquote morality actually putting people in danger, it's such an outdated notion of morality. It's such a silly place to kind of try to keep people down. But anyways, it became
And then it
increasingly
becomes a business because there's court fees and all these. I mean, come on, the prison system, you get that labor for very cheap. I mean, there's so many other parts
so
of that down the road that it goes that it can.
absolutely. So I will tell you time and time again in those couple years. There's one particular story that sticks in my mind, but time and time again, I went on Monday morning to visit women who had been arrested over the weekend, whose children, and they had been arrested over the weekend, for prostitution. These were women who doing whatever they could to get their, quote unquote, their lives together, right? And because again of the situations we put people in when they have to make certain choices that we don't like, we then punish them further. There was one particular woman, I haven't told this story in a couple years now at this point, but I'll try to get it right. She had 3 children. I knew her for 2 years before she was arrested, and she was doing anything within her power to keep her children together, to keep a roof over her head. And most of her day was spent running around to various government offices that would then send her to another, right? But if she didn't go get them to sign her little
Like the
paper,
thing, like you're in the wrong line, you got to fill out this form, get the yellow form, then you
yeah,
got to fill that out,
yeah,
get the red stamp from the blue place in the
yeah,
yellow building, and the
yeah.
yeah.
But like across town, so,
Yeah,
and
oh,
this is
absolutely.
just
Like it's a complete scape. It's like a snipe hunt or like a
correct.
scavenger hunt almost.
And this is just for the bare minimum. So there's no time in the day to earn an income for anything else that you might need for your children, which newsflash, you need a lot. And so she did sex work on the weekends. And that was, I'm pretty sure, if memory serves me correctly, that was not something that we could discuss with anyone else. It was kind of, if the program had, and I mentioned the name of the program, it's wonderful. This is not a knock on them, but that was not something that, it still is not something that, unless you are working with an organization that focuses specifically on sex workers, nobody knows what to do with it, and they're terrified by it instead of just treating people like humans. Anyways, she was a wonderful mother. She was doing what she could. She could not work normal hours to earn extra income because, as I just described to you, her full-time job was running around town to the various government
Right.
offices that she was forced to run around to.
Right. And the attention you're even talking about is not just the money and the means for providing clothes, food, and everything. How about the time of being with your child?
It's
You don't even get
exhausting.
that either
It's
because she's
exhausting.
running around doing these things.
And sex work, we'll go back to the, what for us feels like a cliche, but we're still always explaining to people, sex work is work. And like any job, it was the job she chose that best suited her circumstances at that time. If she had been able to work full time during the day, maybe she wouldn't have turned to sex work, but she did. That's neither here nor there.
It's really nobody's business, right? On
It's
top
really
of
nobody's
even at a
business.
broader scale, it's like she's making a living, her means are providing, they're not affecting, I would assume the children are not involved, and there's nothing with that. So this is okay, right? This
No,
is separate. This is adult world. This is
this
adult
was
work
a
world.
situation
This is separate.
in which she would, make provisions to, she was a single mother too. I'm a single mother. it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And if you don't have family and if you don't have, outside help, but she would make provisions for children. She would not leave. A lot of people would leave their children unattended. This woman in particular never did. And it was either a Friday or Saturday night. And she was assaulted by, we say that criminalization allows bad actors to pose as clients. So she was not assaulted by a client. She was assaulted by somebody who knew under the guise of criminality, he would have easy access to a woman who society had cast aside anyways. So luckily enough, she was attacked, but she was able to get out of his home. She had to break a window. There was property damage. I don't remember the details. The cops, at some point when she was walking back from, had left on foot, walking home, cops stopped her and she was arrested for prostitution because he had called to report the damage. This was late, this is a perfect storm. This was late on a Saturday night. So she was not going to see a judge until Monday morning. She was
Right.
not
So
able.
can you say that again? It cut out. So she was assaulted by this gentleman and then she fought back?
She was assaulted and or felt unsafe, for some reason, which happens because sex workers are not able to do the things they need to do to keep themselves safe because of criminalization. And we'll touch on that in a second.
Right.
And
Well, it's
it
not
was
like it's not like a good Samaritan's walking with a sex worker because that stigma that you're talking about. It's like, why am I going to protect a sex worker? They're just the
well,
dredge of
we will
society,
talk
the
about
whatever society.
we'll talk about why sex workers need immunity laws in a little bit. But whatever it
Oh, for
was,
sure.
a window had been broken or something. She had gotten out, and because of the property damage, he called the cops to report whatever it was. Who knows what was said, what happened.
Right.
She was arrested for prostitution. Because of the way the criminal legal system works in this country, that was late on a Saturday night. For whatever reason, she didn't get her phone call. She couldn't reach her mom. By the time she saw a judge on Monday morning and could connect with me and with her family, the babysitter had reported the children as abandoned to DCF.
And
Their
there's
mom
no
had
way for
been,
her to contact anyone, right? It's not like she could
no,
contact them.
no. And this woman thought she was coming home that night. So she's not, these are things people take for granted that your babysitter, anyways. So her kids were taken away because DCF got involved. And now this woman, again, with the systems, this woman was only eligible for housing with her children. That was the deal. It was housing for women with children. So when she doesn't have her children, she lost her
Loses
housing.
the housing.
But then if you don't have a home, how do you get your
You don't get
kids
a
back?
job. Right.
And
How do
how
you
do you
get
get a
right? How
job?
do you get kids? How do you get a
Like
job? How do you get
right. So all that happened from this arrest was this woman and homeless again, this time without her children. Her children ended up in the system. And why? Because she needed to supplement her income and chose a job that if society had allowed her it's not even allowing, it's just not messing with something that doesn't need to be messed with. I mean, we talk
Right.
about prohibition and with alcohol, prohibition makes people do terrible things. And so
And
let's
the
get into
government
some of the
poisoned
policy.
alcohol during Prohibition. The government poisoned its own American citizens in the alcohol during Prohibition to try to get people to stop. They poisoned a number of people to death. This
Right.
is how our government interferes. This is how they
The
help.
government
This is how
does
they help, right?
terrible things. Yes. Well, people, do terrible things to each other when they're on, pushed into the dark and people aren't allowed to come out of the shadows and ask for help. It also, if we want to draw the parallel of poisoning the alcohol, police sexual violence towards sex
Exactly.
workers is
Yeah.
a huge
I
issue.
mean, same. It's aligned with it parallels the decriminalization of marijuana, for
Of
example,
course.
as a
Of
can,
course.
with cannabis and things like that. So that is all supremely interesting. And so this woman loses her children, she loses her house, can't get the children back because she lost the house, and can't get these other
So
things because of that. And it
all
just
that being
snowballs
able to
down there.
arrest her for prostitution did was, set her and she, and I I wonder where she is now, and I wonder what could have been different. And there was nothing that I could do. I don't know what I thought I might have been able to do, but with all the access to resources and letters and bail money, and I couldn't get her kids back. And went on through the years working in domestic violence shelters, um, and then landed at a nonprofit immigration law firm, because there's no right to an attorney in immigration proceedings. So, even 3-year-old children are forced to
I live
represent
in Arizona,
themselves.
so I'm a border town, so or
Yeah,
a border
yeah.
state, so I'm very
So we,
at least familiar with the
right.
things that are going on and how the crimes are at the border. I mean, the more
Well,
that
and
I mean,
so
there's
that's
payoffs to border
another
agents, there's criminal sex work, there's trafficking through there.
correct.
It's
And so
pretty
that
crazy
that
through
was
Arizona.
another kind of awakening for me. Awakening is the wrong word, but when people are pushed out of the traditional labor force for any reason, whether it's lack of immigration status, lack of employment, discrimination because they're transgender or disabled, they sex work is often a job that makes the most sense for them. And if you aren't giving people the right to work in this country legally, they are going to turn to the informal labor sector. And sex work is one of those places. Criminalizing sex work there is what allows trafficking and exploitation to proliferate. I mean, that's what it allows it everywhere, but you see it so clearly when you talk about foreign nationals and labor trafficking. And 80%, the number might even be higher now. I haven't looked in a couple months, but at a minimum, 80% of trafficking that takes place around the world is in industries other than commercial sex. So we're talking about hospitality, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking
Physical
about,
labor. Physical labor's one. I mean, I remember Qatar hosting the FIFA soccer and the hundreds of people that died that were slave labor coming into the thing, building the stadiums for the soccer games.
well,
I
I told
remember
you about
seeing that.
working. And when I say I worked at a nonprofit law firm, I was never a lawyer during any of this time, but I worked in direct service at all the shelters. And then
Well, legal adjacent, you know.
always, yeah. And then was in development and communications there. I feel like I should just make it clear that I'm, not holding myself out to be a lawyer. But I, was just talking about the unaccompanied minors that we would represent. Um, there too, there would be 15-year-olds, right, whose parents were desperate to get them to a family member, not even younger too, in, Central and South America, desperate to get them away from gangs. And so they send them to a family member here. Well, because our immigration system, along with many of our other systems, is also so screwed up, there was no way for these people to get out of desperate situations other than to reach the border and say, I need help, or to turn to a smuggler. Smugglers hold people and make them work to pay their debt back. It's what we call debt bondage. And I get so worked up talking about this because these are the things that people aren't paying attention to because they're being fed a false narrative of what sex trafficking is. And all of the misdirected energy and resources that, are disproportionately funneled to fight quote unquote sex trafficking and to fight it in the wrong ways are being funneled away from all these other industries because people want to talk about sex, right? It's the most until they don't. But when it's
Sex, drugs, and
exploitation,
rock and roll.
it's the
Those are the
most
three.
salacious. And, I
Yeah.
live in Miami where we see people all the time talking about sex trafficking, but nobody wants to talk about what's going on in the fields 10 miles south of us. And again, it is the fact that I have to remind people of this when I talk about it blows my mind, but we're not diminishing trafficking into commercial sex at all. Where and when it happens, it is one of the most horrific human rights abuses,
That
and
is
traffickers should be. Did I lose
still a
you?
criminal act. That is labor like that. Obviously, it has nothing to do with what the labor's for. It's a criminal act to traffic.
Correct.
You know what I
And
mean? So I think we're aligned that the trafficking's the illegality
well,
here,
right.
not
So
the
this is
sex work
if
part,
we
not
want to go back
why
to
they're
kind
being
of
trafficked.
If we want to go back to sex work 101 for a moment, we talk about it as existing on a spectrum from choice to circumstance to coercion. And I guess we should just define trafficking. Trafficking is compelling another individual to do something against their will through force, fraud, or coercion, whether it's sex, whether it's forcing them to work in the fields while you hold on to their passport. You know, I spent years working in domestic violence shelters as well. And, you know, Taken and movies like that have really done society a disservice, because most of the trafficking into commercial sex really kind of appears more like intimate partner violence, right? And again, the root causes of trafficking are systemic vulnerabilities. So if
There does
you
seem to be like a grooming aspect with young people at first. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem to be like I'm grabbing you. You know, there's a Stockholmian aspect to
they
it
don't
almost. It's
there
not.
are enough vulnerable people, sadly, that nobody needs to be plucking white girls from the mall in Minnesota. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but
No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
it's not where we need to be turning our attention. And nobody is looking at the root causes, which are these systemic and structural violence and inequities that make people vulnerable. So as you just said, you know, sadly, a really common example is, or common refrain is, a transgender child who is forced out of their home by their family, or for whatever reason loses kind of their social and familial connections, and they meet somebody who's nice and who takes them out to dinner and who buys them things anyone would like, and it's a nice
Gives
relationship.
them attention, makes them feel special. There's so
And at a
much to it.
certain point, you know, they will compel them to do things. And so it's not, you know, again, instead of, I'm going to let you ask me a question because
Oh
I'm
no,
all,
please continue. I love this. This because I have a
okay.
couple questions, but they're very weird because I ask odd questions that I
Well, I
probably
realized
haven't heard
too,
before.
we're on the defense so much, so I find myself being defensive. I realize even
Yeah,
when I don't necessarily have to be, but I guess
I
I'll tell you a
understand
little
that.
bit about what's
Well, that
happening
shows your
policy
passion, though.
wise.
So I like to call it passionate versus defense because the thing is, you have to because you remember there's a force acting against your cause, whatever your cause is, anybody's cause. You have to hit not with equal force because you won't move the needle, you won't move the window. So you have to kind of overcompensate a little bit. You're
Well,
gonna get a little bit over passionate and get emotion. You know, that's the whole point,
it's
though,
just,
because you have to show that.
yeah, we're fighting the same battle, and actually it's getting it's getting even harder at the moment for a number of reasons. But I think now maybe I'll touch on some of the actual policy things we're seeing, and kind of models for governing sex work, so people even
Yeah.
have a, you know, can have a reference point for what we're asking for. We did delve right in. So um, there are four models for governing sex work that are predominant around I shouldn't say predominant, that exists around the world. Criminalization, both the buying and selling of sex is criminalized. Legalization, um, the buying and selling of sex is regulated by the government. Well,
It'll be licensed. You'd have a receipt. You'd pay taxes.
perhaps, and a good moment to point out, lots of sex workers pay taxes even while it's not
Oh,
legalized.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you're 1099, right? Or not you, but a collective
But
you of the
yep,
sex
there
workers
are
would be
workshops
1099.
out there, and a lot of sex work. It's a
Right.
good, you know what, Mark? We should go back to some definitions. You don't want to take any of this for granted, because a
Yes,
lot of
please.
sex
Let's
work
do it.
is
Yeah,
legal.
let's make this as accessible to all because this is really important that people understand what it is you're advocating. For
Right.
sure.
So I'll just mention the two more governing frameworks, which are decriminalization, the removal of all penalties for buying or selling sex, and then the fourth is the policy model that goes by many names. We call it the entrapment model, the Nordic model, Swedish model, and demand model, rebranded in the US insidiously as the equality model. And what this model does is it removes penalties for selling sex. It keeps and or increases penalties for buying sex. And so when you hear the name end demand model, that comes from this theory that, and this is second wave prohibitionist feminists, this is their model and their theory, that if they arrest enough clients, sex will go away. And the equality model, that term comes from this really outdated, dangerous kind of notion that they perpetuate, that all sex workers are women and all buyers are men. And so therefore there cannot be equality between the sexes. That's kind of where that was born. And, now they've stretched that to other places. But let's go back to some definitions for a second. So sex
Well,
work,
really
the
quickly on
term,
that, if I may. So they were only going to criminalize the buyers, but not the sellers of the sex. And they would think, oh, if they get rid of the demand, the supply will go away.
okay, so don't worry. Where we left off was the entrapment model, and I'm gonna go way back to that. That's like what we're talking
Yeah,
about next. That's where we're going.
perfect.
Um,
The
but
entrapment model. So basically what I was saying was that's like when New York started charging extra for like sugary drinks. Like you're going to stop drinking sugary drinks just because you're going to, it's going to
well,
stop the urge to do that.
right, but it's a step further than that. It's like going into a liquor store and the person can sell me the liquor, but I'm going to be arrested for buying it. Well, what does it make the
Right.
person who has to sell the liquor do then? They're the ones who now are at your mercy. So it's wild that their system and their idea for eradicating commercial sex, which we know will never happen, right? So it's like a fool's errand. They are literally punishing people and making it more dangerous for them while they are telling people that they can end commercial sex. And policy wise, we're in battling it out right now in New York, in Massachusetts. In Maine, the entrapment model folks won, and they enacted entrapment model policy there 16 months ago, last summer. So, remains to be seen how many suffer there because of that. But let me just start with even the definition for sex work, and then I'm going to tell you more about the entrapment
Yeah,
model. So,
absolutely.
it's important to remind people that a lot of sex work itself is legal. Stripping, camming, porn, all of those things fall under the umbrella term of sex work. When we're talking about decriminalization, we are most frequently talking about prostitution, which is what it's called in the law, and it's direct service sex work, full contact. Those are other terms you will hear. So I guess it's a good. I'm going to go back to legalization for a moment so people understand that, and then we'll delve into entrapment model stuff. So legalization, as we said earlier, would be the imposition of rules and regulations to the commercial sex industry, which is not in and of itself a bad thing. The issue is where there is only legalization, but not decriminalization. The same people who are left out of the traditional labor force for a lot of reasons are still left out in the cold. And they're literally left out in the cold because, as we said earlier, there's nothing inherently dangerous about sex work. It's that there are these laws and this stigma around it. So,
Right. And then you'd have, with the legalization, like you said, there'd be licensing. So you'd have to follow all of those qualifications
and
to
if you
actually
didn't, you'd be arrested.
actually legal anyway. And if you
Right.
miss one of the steps, you're not legal. If you don't get the acceptance, I'm sure the licensing would require, they would have to qualify you, or they'd have to actually approve
Well,
you
I
for
can
the
tell
license.
you what
So,
it does require, because legalization exists in a couple rural counties in Nevada, where people get it wrong. They think prostitution is legal around Nevada. It's not. It's legalized in these brothels in these very, very rural counties. And Las Vegas, at least with the last year's data, Nevada, had the highest rate of arrests for prostitution per capita of anywhere else in the country. So that tells you
I
what
would totally
legalization
believe that.
does for the
Mhm.
others operating, outside of it, which is why a lot of people have to turn to sex work in the first place. But these brothels, women who choose to work there, they have to comply with these onerous, a lot of times, rules and regulations. There's also a lot of benefit to people who want to work in a licensed brothel. because sex work is criminalized, again, that gives owners a lot more leverage than they should have over people who want to organize and work together. So again, legalization where we haven't also decriminalized is a problem.
Right. And to that point, if I may, that on a business side, just on an economic side, that they're writing in legislation for current business owners who already have the power and already are in the business, who don't need to make extra payments to adjust to these new regulations. They put new ones in to keep other businesses, or to your point, keep other groups from getting together to even create their own businesses to counter those.
Right.
So
Well,
like it's
and
funny because we find that the regulations are written now to more to keep other businesses out, to keep competition out, not actually for the safety and security of
well,
people.
right. Once
It's not really
you're in, and when we say we want to decriminalize consensual adult sex work, you get accused of really awful things like, oh, so you're like for public indecency, or you want to see awful things happen to children, all of those things. So we do sadly need to make it clear when those things are illegal and they should stay illegal. When we are talking about decriminalizing consensual adult sex work, we are talking about it within the confines of a home, a hotel, a brothel, a private setting. And, we don't have to like guess about what these models can do because they exist all around the world, all of them. And there's data. So New Zealand decriminalized consensual adult sex work in 2003. So there are 20 years of data out of New
20
Zealand.
years. Wow.
More, I guess, 21. It was 2003. And the data has shown that violence and exploitation in the sex trade has decreased dramatically. Sex workers are able to come forward when they are assaulted to get a perpetrator off the streets. They have bargaining power when it comes to their workplace. They are able to set rules for themselves about how clients operate within their brothels, within their businesses, condomless
And with
sex.
themselves. I mean, even the
Exactly.
personal boundaries and things.
Well, and if they don't get paid, that's wage theft. That's not the case here, right? Um, and also that's rape. I just need to put that out there because there's no
Well,
consent involved if there was
yeah,
supposed to be money exchange.
correct. There wasn't the contract has not been completed clearly, so that
But
obviously would then be a violation of someone.
the point is that in New Zealand, sex workers can access the same protections and, you know, access to justice that folks who are not stigmatized the way they are can. And it's not perfect. We talked about how immigration issues on top of being a sex worker is a whole other thing. So there's, a battle right now, rightly so, to be sure that undocumented people in New Zealand engaged in sex work also are able to access those same protections if they need medical care, if they, are assaulted, victimized in any way. So the data has shown that violence and exploitation decreased dramatically. You will hear proponents of entrapment model legislations hold out New Zealand as a failure because they will say things so there have been 0 arrests for trafficking in New Zealand. They claim that that's because what the Prostitution Reform Act of 2003 did was remove trafficking from their code of laws or whatever. It did not. That is a lie. They have a different term for it. That's how they can say
Okay.
that. But other countries have not stopped because they've decriminalized consensual adult sex work. They have not stopped prosecuting traffickers and exploiters. So New Zealand, we hold out as the hope. Closer to home, Rhode Island, through a legal loophole, in the 90s, there was about 20 years, the exact years escape me right now, where Rhode Island decriminalized consensual adult sex work. It took them a little bit to catch up with the fact that that had happened. And then, of course, they recriminalized it. But all the data, the good data, the actual data that came out of Rhode Island at that time showed that violence against women dropped drastically. And again, public health increased. So there were specific, it's a story, a study out of the London School of Economics that I don't have the stats in my head right now, but it's in the incidence of STIs around Rhode Island during that time period as well. it was recriminalized. Uh, you know, hope died there. Um,
Now, how when did that get recriminalized, and what's the data since? Obviously,
yeah,
you could then do a direct overlay of those
yeah, nobody's done
data points.
that enough since, and they're
Yeah,
it's hard to
and it does
say.
take time for
Yes,
that
and
really to
it
come in.
is, because it was kind of a quote unquote natural experiment, there you have to say correlation, causation, but we know what the data showed then. We also know what the data shows from countries where the entrapment model has been implemented. It goes by the Nordic model a lot, but Sweden was actually the first to implement the entrapment model legislation in. I should have looked at all my years again at the end of the day. I believe 1999.
No worries.
Um,
It's a long
since
day. It's no worries. Like I said,
and
we're trying
there's
to
lots
understand
of
the
dates.
concepts as a whole. So
Since then, in Norway, in Sweden, in Northern Ireland, in Canada, the data is unequivocal and abundant that where the entrapment model has been enacted, violence and trafficking not only continue to proliferate, they increase because sex workers are the balance of criminality and the balance of power has shifted. You'll hear sex workers say, we'd rather um I didn't know if I'd lost you again. We'd
no,
rather,
no, I'm here. I'm listening.
exist under criminalization where we at least bear some of the criminality as well, because when the client bears all the criminality, they also hold all the cards, right? So we'll talk about Sesta Fosta and those types of things too if you want, but sex workers have had to devise systems for themselves to keep themselves safe. What laws do is disrupt the very systems that they had to keep themselves safe. So, screening clients is something that everybody should be able to do from the comfort of their home on the internet, like they used to do before Sesta Fosta was signed into law. But where this happens on the street now because of the entrapment model and Sesta Fosta, people have to make snap judgments, and the person who's paying you decides where to go, where to meet, they hold all the cards. And newsflash, just because they're not arresting you for prostitution doesn't mean they're not arresting you for a whole host of other things. So in Norway, it
Right.
was in,
It becomes cumulative. So they're like, oh, you have a little bit of marijuana or crack on you. Plus you have this. Plus you did this. Plus you have a previous warrant. Plus you have this, and it just keeps piling up. And
right.
these
So
people cannot get out of that, right?
when you hear this theory on paper, most people, it initially, I don't blame people for thinking it sounds fantastic. We don't want sex workers arrested, right? So yeah, let's not have penalties for them. But sure, buying's kind of, this is me saying it's what somebody else says, buying's kind of icky.
Right,
So
right,
I
right.
get
I see
that.
what you're saying. Yeah.
Um,
So
and
could
people,
we talk about Sesta Fosta, because you
yes, I want
mentioned
to
that
say
just
one more
recently?
thing.
Oh
I
yeah,
want to say one more
absolutely.
thing, just to be clear. People will call the entrapment model legislation, you'll hear terms like partial decriminalization or partial criminalization. And to me, the point that I want people to remember most is there's no such thing as partial criminalization or decriminalization. It's law enforcement and criminalization that make sex work dangerous. And when half of the transaction is criminalized, the whole industry is still criminalized. So not only does this not solve any of the problems of criminalization, what it also adds to the pile is, and this fool's errand to save, quote unquote, save sex workers from themselves, they're also reinforcing the stigma that sex work is bad, right? Because the industry needs to go away. So, and they've set us up in this awful zero sum situation where they're telling people that they have to either choose survivors of trafficking or sex workers. Well, that's not true. It's not one or the other. We do this to bolster anti-trafficking efforts. But anyways, yes, we can talk about that stuff last time.
Yeah. So share with us what that exactly means for anyone who's not familiar with that.
Yes. So SESTA FOSTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, and the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, one's the House version, one's the Congress version. So it's a package of laws, the package of bills signed into law in 2018. And what they did was they amended Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 holds that platforms are not liable for what their users post. Platforms can't bear that liability. They just can't. So what this law was intended to do, or at least, purported to do, was to shut down trafficking online. It did the total opposite, because it put people in much more vulnerable situations than they were before. Sex workers used a number of sites to arrange dates with clients. Having a day or two between contacting a client and meeting that client is a tried and true safety practice. You ask for a license, you ask for references, whatever it is that you may do if you are not somebody who has to make a snap decision on the street, right? And street-based sex work is the most dangerous sex work because people are literally vulnerable out on the street.
Right. And
When
that is
sex
absolutely beyond transactional. That is literally like meeting contact, your direct sales.
Correct.
I know it's
When
like a short way to say that, but that's your client. It's a service-based
Yeah, and if
industry.
you are having to negotiate right then and there, and you might get arrested for just standing there, you might not use your best judgment, and you might
Right.
get into it's too much to ask somebody to do. So when Sesta Fosta led to the shutdown of Backpage, Craigslist, erotic services, all of these sites, sex workers were literally pushed back out onto the street. I think one of the stats out of San Francisco was, street-based sex work increased 3%, like threefold, 3 times over immediately after Sesta Fosta. And so we know that that's the most dangerous form of sex work. And now we've pushed people out there to do it. It's a huge free speech issue. And it was one of those laws where the unintended consequences were never really considered, even though sex workers and librarians and many other free speech advocates were warning people.
Well, I have a lot of libertarian-minded people, so let's be honest. Silk Road. Look at Ross. Ross is still in prison. He's been in
Yeah,
prison for 12 years for owning Silk Road. The people on his site were the ones doing criminal acts. He's not
of course. and
responsible
and
for that, but they needed a scapegoat and they needed him
and the
off the
people
board so
on this
Amazon
site,
could proliferate.
sorry,
No,
as
no,
we
it's
discussed
okay.
earlier, I get passionate, so I interrupt.
I love it. No, bring it.
So the Department of Justice, while everyone was watching this horrible law, make its way through through Congress and the House and get signed into law, the Department of Justice itself said, "Don't sign this law. The way we do actually catch people is through these online, whatever it is, the platforms, the communications they had." They said this law was the equivalent of turning on a light in a room full of cockroaches. 3 years, all their investigations, everything scattered. 3 years, so 2021, 3 years after Sesta Fosta was signed into law, and I don't need to convince you, but these things are just too rich to not share.
No, no,
The
you have to
government,
share that though, because you're not compelling me in any way. You have to compel other people. So
right?
share the information because it needs to
But
be
I
as
mean, it's
realistic
so
and
blatant. But in 2021, 3 years after Sesta Fosta was signed into law, the government's own GAO, the Government Accountability Office, declared it an abject failure. It was not used. I think it was used in 1 or 2 prosecutions, where there were other remedies available to prosecutors who they had tried, relied on those remedies to try traffickers for years. And the truth is, we keep seeing instances of laws like this eroding all our rights. The First Amendment, name an amendment, pick an amendment, in the name of fighting sex trafficking, which we all know is a terrible thing. Everybody wants to fight it. But because our country is being told it's something that it's not, of course, people who care about other people are going to support a law like Sesta Fosta. They are being told that they have to, that that's the only way.
Well, this is the thing when they paint something criminal, just calling it criminal makes the average non-criminal American think it's bad. It's like it affects them in a safety and security way.
Right.
So if you can get rid of the crime, then you can be more safe and secure. And they're willing to give up those liberties for the security. And we know how that works. You lose both.
Well,
That's really
sadly, a
how it
lot
happens.
of the people who make our laws and a lot of the people who are most vocal about supporting them, yes, in their mind, because of the places and ways in which they were raised, laws keep us safe. The police are who we call when we need help, when something's going wrong. Well, for most of the country, that's when they're most at risk. Laws don't keep them safe, and the police put them in danger. So people are sitting, in their ivory towers and on their laptops advocating for these laws that don't affect them, that don't affect them
And let's be
at
honest,
all.
they have these degrees and they're sitting in a vacuum. It's not like they've ever been on a street to watch how people make their living, how they interact, how it even works. You know what I
Right.
mean?
And
It's not like
now
they
I
even
should say too, there
experience.
are some amazing researchers and academics in the field of sex work and economics who, have done really,
Please
really
share them.
important
Yeah,
research.
absolutely.
Yeah, if you have show notes or something, we have a resource page on our website that
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll
points
put
to
it in
all
the
the
show
data.
notes. Yeah.
Just because we always want to make sure primary sources are available
Yeah, we want to make sure. Yeah,
to
absolutely.
people. But yeah, to go back to, I guess if you want to talk about like the streets, we can talk about like loitering for the purposes of prostitution
So I
laws.
have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, okay, so obviously you want to decriminalize that. Do you ever come across a case that you're trying to protect a person, not from being criminalized, but like someone who, I guess, do you have any cases that you fight? What kind of cases do you fight for these people? Like what
Sure. I think I know what you're asking. So
I
we
hope I'm
we
asking
do
the right question. I'm trying to explain,
we
ask
do
it correctly,
policy
but
work. Oh, well, so decriminalize sex work ourselves. We do policy work. We don't have any
okay.
individual clients, and wherever we go, we work with wherever we're working with grassroots local organizations. But we work on policy. But some of the things people at DSW have worked in the past are for protecting individual sex workers and survivors of trafficking. DSW it was founded in 2018 in the wake of Sesta Fosta, by four incredible individuals. Three of them are still there. Are the first director of communications. Bailey has a one-woman show, Whore's Eye View, that I highly recommend everyone check out. But she went to pursue that, and I was lucky enough to join the team. And one of the founders, Melissa Sontag Bruto, studied at Johns Hopkins. She has a JD/MPH because she knew that she wanted to go into this field at some point. And so for years, she represented sex workers and survivors of trafficking. Melissa was the first person to bring and win what's called a vacator suit. Just an idea of some of the individual remedies that, the things that have to be fixed because our laws are so broken. Survivors of trafficking are often arrested over and over again before they are freed from their trafficker. So again, law enforcement's involvement, they are so much more scared of their trafficker than of law enforcement. And so they're going to get arrested, and they're not, because there is no safe place to actually put them and the systems aren't in place to actually help them. Puts them in worse danger to tell the police
Right, it
what's
just makes
going
a
on.
revolving door and they go back to the abuser. I mean,
So, right, right, and you said abuser, it's true. It's, more like intimate
and if
partner.
they talk, I mean, imagine if they talk, imagine the ramifications. They find out they talk. And I mean, I can only imagine how the
Right.
pressure of police,
And
I
again,
watch police put pressure on
another
people and the tactics they use to get people to talk. People will say anything to get out of like trouble. I mean, I've seen it, oh, was it John? Was it this guy? Was it this guy? And they're like, they just say yes, on
well,
the,
and if you're being exploited, you'll often say what you need to say to protect your trafficker because that law enforcement
that's your
isn't
bread and
actually
butter.
equipped
Yeah.
to deal with what you're going through. So people are often arrested multiple times for crimes they were forced to commit by their trafficker. So whether it's prostitution over and over again, whether it's, shoplifting is something that happens. So vacator laws allowed people who were convicted of sex work, prostitution in New York who had been compelled to do it through force, fraud, coercion, to clear those arrests from their record. So like that's an example of people's, again, I don't people take for granted an arrest in this country. If like you're not aware, it fucks your life up. Your ability to sustain life, employment, housing, anything from one arrest, it can send you into a spiral. We call it the collateral consequences of arrest.
A very general one that we all are aware of is probably a DUI. Many people at least know somebody who's had one. Just that alone, you talk about the days of prison, the cost of that. I've seen that absolutely affect people's lives to a very negative offense. Yours is that times a million because it's on your record to the point where you can't get a job, you're
And
unemployable, they're
listen,
gonna put a stigma on
a,
you.
a DUI puts other people at risk. If you're driving under the
Right.
influence, you
Even
put
on
other
top of it,
people at
right,
risk.
right.
If you're a sex worker, you haven't
Yeah.
put anyone at risk. So, it's not
Right. And it's not an apples to apples by any means. It's just the one that we'd probably be most Americans be
the
familiar with somebody
missed
who's had
work,
that and the effect of what an arrest would do,
and people are living so far on the margins already that one missed day of work, one missed car payment means no vehicle to get to work, to keep your job, to keep your apartment. I mean, people are screwed for life when we arrest them for prostitution, whether buying or selling. The stigma for clients too, who let's talk about immunity laws for a second, because
Yeah,
we will wrap
absolutely.
this
Yeah.
up at some point. It's a good
Well,
lens
absolutely.
through
Yeah,
which
please.
to.
It's your time, and thank you so much for joining me because I know you've had a very long day, so it's
It's
very
a
late for you.
pleasure.
So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Um,
So immunity laws.
Immunity laws. So because sex work is criminalized, when a sex worker is assaulted by a bad actor, they often don't go to report it because they fear their own arrest, and they may not go seek medical attention because they fear their own arrest. So 8 or 9 states.
So, for example, you went to a hospital, you'd have to report, what happened to you and all those kinds of things, and those
And
kinds of answers would
you just don't know
get you in
because of
trouble. Right.
stigmatization too. You've been so mistreated by doctors,
Right.
by whoever. But the
Absolutely.
point is, most sex workers, by virtue of the fact that they are criminalized, are not eager to go to law enforcement for anything, but they do want to protect their community. So if there is a bad actor in the community and they can't come forward to sound the alarm bell, or to sound the alarm bell that they think somebody is underage, whatever it may be, there are things that they would like to do, and that I shouldn't say regular people, that what people consider regular people take for granted, which is when you're hurt, when you're assaulted, when a crime is committed against you, you should have the option to seek justice and to get that perpetrator held accountable. Sex workers are denied that option. The biggest, example of kind of this issue are serial killers. Serial killers, this is, sounds sensational, but it's not. Nearly every serial killer in history kind of has said that they prey on sex workers because they know that they are cast aside and that nobody will look for them. Samuel Little, the Green River Killer in Seattle, said, I looked for prostitutes because I knew nobody would care. And last summer, it was reignited in the news on Long Island and nationally, the Gilgo Beach serial killer. So I'll try to make this brief.
Yeah, that's the guy with the hair in the pizza box or something, right?
Rex Heuermann was arrested somebody was arrested for a bunch of these murders. So
and then everybody started talking like, oh yeah, that guy was a creep. We thought he was nuts or something. And you're like, you couldn't say not a thing.
There's worse than that. There's worse than that. So who knows, there might be other killers out there, but just, to orient everyone, about 20 years ago, bodies started turning up on Long Island. And when they were identified, most of them, their family or friends had come forward to say that they were engaged in sex work. And Melissa, who I talked about before, our legal director, and Crystal, who is one of the founders of DSW, they spent years, actually they, Crystal kind of put together. It's called the Sex Workers Project. It sadly no longer exists. And it was part of the Urban Justice Center in New York. And Crystal is a licensed psychotherapist. She provided counseling to survivors of trafficking and sex workers. Melissa was a lawyer. There were other lawyers as well in New York. And when those bodies started turning up, clients of theirs would say, we think we know who this is. We think we knew who did this, but we don't want to come forward because we can't risk being arrested for prostitution, right? For all the reasons we just said. So Melissa and Crystal and some others actually tried to broker a deal with the Suffolk County Police Department for immunity for these people who had information on a killer. And the Suffolk County Police Department said, no, thanks. We would rather retain the ability to arrest you than to take any useful information from you. And so bodies kept turning up, and they were sex workers. And the investigation, because of that and a number of reasons, was botched and handed over. And finally, last summer, there was, a break in the case. And then all these people but did come forward. And this is the perfect example of where and why an immunity law is so crucial and so vital. It's like one of the band-aids we have to all the dangers of criminalization in the meantime is to allow people, when they or somebody they know or see has been victimized, to come forward.
Like a whistleblower law in a way, it's like
Well,
protecting a
the
whistleblower.
closest parallel is like a Good Samaritan law for drugs. If
Right. Yeah.
if you are with a friend who overdoses, people used to not call for help because they didn't want to get arrested. Well, at a certain point, we realized you got to let people drive their friend to the hospital, and we'll tell you we're not going to arrest you, but just get them help. It's the same thing. And we are seeing, for a while, nobody was really opposing these immunity laws places. They just wouldn't kind of get enough traction. But recently, we've seen the entrapment model proponents also attacking these immunity laws, which again, a law that would help the actual people they're purporting to care about. So, for example, in Rhode Island, where an immunity law has been introduced year after year after year, and survivors of trafficking and sex workers come forward at the hearings and plead for legislators to pass these laws. This year, we were close to seeing it pass again. And there's an organization, NCOSI, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. They were called Morality in Media. Before that, they're anti-porn crusaders under the guise of fighting trafficking. One of their lawyers, and the Boston Globe ran this, is total fabrication, said that immunity laws enabled and encouraged trafficking because we would want to provide immunity to traffickers, and they love throwing around this term pimp, which pimp is, a racialized term. But the point is if you hate them,
It's like such a stigmatized thing that you draw a picture in your head the second you hear.
Correct. So that's why they use this word, right? You could say manager, but so they use
That's why
this
they
word,
use like weed or what, like they use all these slang terms because they evoke
and in the
those
life, like
feelings,
when you
those
hear
instant emotional feelings.
these groups talk about sex work, you'll hear them say in the life. That's kind of a buzzword for knowing you're listening to somebody who doesn't actually care about the health and safety. They're on this moral crusade. But there's so many points I was in the middle of making as usual, but there was one, morality in media. So, but NCOSI now, they were quoted in the media as saying something like the bill had as many loopholes in it as Swiss cheese and would allow pimps and traffickers immunity, which even on its face value, nobody, and they, we ask for retractions and stuff all the time. Nobody stopped to think that the bill itself, it says it there too, it only provides immunity for prostitution. There is no way that if you committed another crime and you were being held accountable for that you could get immunity. Like it
Right.
just didn't make sense. But they would rather see, and anything that feels like a step towards decriminalization, they shut down immediately. And people really are dying because of it, literally. And whether it's
I
because
would
they're
even think the suffering part is worse. Like dying, I mean, death is obviously the worst thing, but imagine years of just physical, emotional abuse, the suffering, and that just living with that is so
well, you
burdensome
typically the immunity
for people.
laws is more um for what am I trying to say? Yes, if you were worried, if you were being trafficked and you wanted to come forward to report your trafficker, you should be
Right.
able to do that without fear of your own arrest, which sadly happens because, our laws
Right.
lump everything into prostitution or everything into trafficking, and they treat them as the same thing, which means both groups get screwed. And again, um, sex workers, because of criminalization, that are wanting to eradicate exploitation and violence just as much as anyone. So the fact that it's painted as this false binary is so challenging. But immunity laws just drive home, I hope so clearly, that it's criminalization that makes it dangerous. And you know people hear the term harm reduction all the time. um, this is such a basic tenet of harm reduction, that you allow people to ask for help when they need it. We're telling people, like, we hate you so much that even if somebody hurts you, we don't want to hear about it. And there were things said, like, to go back to the Gilgo Beach debacle and tragedy, there were things said by police chiefs like, don't worry, everyone, they're just targeting sex workers, whoever it is. Don't worry, the rest of us are safe. So that tells
Yep.
you how the investigation
It's
was
a
treated.
different class. It's a subclass of
The
human. You know,
subclass.
it's a subhuman
So
class.
some of the to touch on policy for a little bit, in addition to immunity, which should be, we say it's incremental, it's needed because of criminalization, but it shouldn't be maligned by opponents as, one step closer to, they call it, like, where the pimp lobby is pushing this. So immunity laws, um, police sexual violence laws, I think people would be shocked to hear that in most states in this country, it is not illegal for a member of law enforcement to have sex with you and then arrest you for prostitution, um, which is so egregious because you don't even need, like, on the base level, aside from the disgusting aspect of it, you don't need to have
It like
somebody
turns my
engage.
stomach.
Yeah. But just on a basic level, like, aside from all of that, if we remove from that, you don't even need to have somebody go through with the act of sex to arrest them for prostitution. So there is no, like, even if that would still be just as gross, even if you needed to, because it's state sanctioned rape. But it doesn't, it's because these people are criminalized that we put them in these situations where this can happen. And other examples of it are law enforcement, because sex work is criminalized, is able to say to somebody they're about to arrest for prostitution, well, if you perform this sexual act for me, I won't arrest you today. So
And then they'll still do it.
whether they do or not, a lot of times
Right.
we don't
Well,
know. But
obviously, right. But it's like, even then, it's like, come
but it's
on, I
the
can't even,
most
yeah.
non-consensual, and nothing, we don't have degrees of terrible
Oh, I
things.
mean, come
Sadly, we
on,
do.
it's complete. It's absolutely quid pro quo. It is absolutely unacceptable. Complete
There's
abuse.
zero
There's no
consent
way around that. That's
involved when
complete
it's you're
non-consent.
choosing between not getting arrested and all the awful things we talked about happen, and giving, performing a sex act. Like, so the power balance there, because of criminalization, presents a whole host of other challenges. Um,
So the
in
power's not in the
Vermont,
person in the sex act. It's the person in the state who administers whether you're a criminal for doing it or not. It's like, that's where those institutions.
well,
The institution isn't good or bad. It's the people who get in it that do the things that, to what you're talking about, to this point where you're just,
Well, we see it
where's
in
the
so
actual
many
compassion?
we see it in so many instances, I think, of ways, it's really the pendulum, just it swings too far in one direction and we're always trying to correct it, and then it swings too far and we're like, wait, there's somewhere in the middle. Like, can we just
Yeah,
kind of
we always govern through the middle. We never govern within the middle. We're always
right?
through it,
And
right?
so
We're
we're
always go to
always
the
trying
extreme.
to correct, quote unquote, correct something else. Um, but I lost when we did our pendulum
No
motion. I
worries.
lost my train of thought.
um, about immunity, we finished up on immunity laws and just
Police
protecting the
sexual
people.
violence. Oh, well, it's what I was going to say. It's a perfect example of preserving systems over people, um, and and putting ideas, whether they're good or bad, or you think they're good or bad, over the reality of what people's actual lives are like. And so it's so distressing. I find it personally distressing when we're in legislative hearings or when I'm doing interviews or debates and we're talking to the media and we're painted as having any interest other than wanting to eradicate violence and exploitation as much as possible. Um,
Right.
because it's not, like I said, it's not a zero sum game. And so it's so sad to me that we can't quite figure out, we have the same, everyone has the same ultimate goal, unless they're, trying to just get rid of porn by calling it anti. Folks who are really interested in eradicating trafficking, we all have the same goal, but there's this fundamental disagreement of where do we exist in reality. And so they would rather continue to send the message that they don't like sex work, which puts people in danger, than just say, whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. And so the best thing we can do is let people come out of the shadows and be safe. And it doesn't mean they're shouting it from the rooftops, right? Like, our society treats sex workers like shit. So you don't have to worry that they're going to proselytize. You don't have to. We were part of the effort to, in Burlington, Vermont, remove from the city ordinance a 100-year-old archaic ban on prostitution, mostly motivated by the awful misogynistic archaic language. And prostitution remains criminalized in the state of Vermont, so a lot of this was symbolic, but it was important from a stigma point of view. And it was about the language, but because that language, when it comes to stigma and sex workers, actually causes people violence. When you refer to sex workers in ways that they should never be referred to, you send the message that they're disposable, that they're discarded, they can be discarded. We don't want them. So when this process was happening, and Kosi and some of the others descended on Burlington and predicted and urged city councilors to not pass this. They predicted that Burlington would become the sex, quote unquote, the sex tourism capital of America. Well, Mark, sorry, I'm disappointed for them. Sorry to report to you that it has not, in fact, become the sex.
Darn it.
Nothing has changed other than wonderful sex worker rights activists there feeling a little more included in their community, and therefore able to self-actualize a little bit and
Right.
and live lives not shrouded in shame. As you know, shame does terrible things to people, and these laws perpetuate, there shouldn't be any shame, but as you said, when things are criminalized, we're a law and order state that tells us they're bad.
Yeah. Look, shame makes you go underground. Underground's not good. Anything outside of visibility. That's why transparency is important. It's like speech. You just have to allow it all, because it's like, that's how you figure out the good stuff from the bad
Well, and
stuff.
when you
The
can't
real good stuff from the
allow
bad stuff.
people to come forward to sound the alarm bell because you've told them that they're so gross and disgusting, what are you actually accomplishing? People want to shove help down people's throats, right? Like, we're going to arrest you to save you, when they're talking about arrest, a common refrain in the sex worker rights movement is rights, not rescue. This country uses arrest to quote unquote rescue sex workers, survivors of trafficking. Police raids on, suspected brothels or massage parlors are often the most traumatic, dangerous thing that happens to sex workers in the course of their
And I can imagine no knock warrants would be part of that, just like they are for drugs. And I've seen the effects of no knock warrants and how people are inside the place that where they administer the no knock warrant, and they have no idea who that is, and they're
it's
just
just
defending their
not
home, and things
it's
get even
not a
crazier.
thing that needs to be regulated by law enforcement, and that's the perfect
That's
example
simple,
of
yeah.
it, right? Like, people have died during police raids a number of times in New York. For what? For what? You didn't offer them services if you thought they were trafficked, and actually, with a lot of these sting operations, like you think about Robert Kraft in Jupiter, a lot of these sting operations and raids in the name of fighting trafficking. Well, you know what? If they were aware that trafficking was going on, they watched it happen for 6 months and then went in and raided and arrested the victims. It happens all the time. And I can't help but point out, when you see in the newspaper human trafficking ring or prostitution ring that's all busted, if you read the article, usually it's consensual adults being arrested for prostitution. So they're not arresting anyone for trafficking, which, that if somebody is engaged in trafficking, please, like, get them. But they're calling it a trafficking ring bust, but they arrested 2 consenting adults. I'll just touch on quickly one of the other terrible things that get slung at individuals asking for the decriminalization of consensual adult sex work is, well, what about the children? Clearly you don't care about children, and clearly, this is going to lead to the sexual
Always about the
exploitation.
children. Any of those acts written with children in it, I know it's balderdash right off the bat, because that's what they use.
Well, what people need to remember too is that trafficking, anyone engaged in quote unquote sex work under the age of 18, even if they tell you that it's consensual, under the age of 18, it is trafficking. So there is no what about the children. And to the extent that it is about the children, it allows people, again, immunity laws, decriminalization, they allow people to sound the alarm bell when something isn't right. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you, you hear all the time of clients who meet with somebody and have the suspicion, and so they don't go through with, the act, but meet with somebody, have the suspicion that they are underage, and have to walk away and not go to law enforcement, not go because they themselves will get arrested. So here, these are actual opportunities for people to come forward and say something bad is happening here. And instead of allowing that, we're telling everyone that their daughters are going to be plucked off their porches in, rural Ohio. And so therefore we need to have all these laws and we need to eradicate commercial sex. Prostitution is not who we indict for trafficking, right? Because prostitution exists, because you wouldn't say that because agriculture exists, there's trafficking into labor.
Right.
But it's prostitution that is often, or that is being indicted, when the real causes of trafficking are structural inequities, poverty, lack of education,
Right. Their power
desperation.
differences that people take advantage of, and
Yeah,
obviously.
when you have no ability to support yourself and your family, and somebody offers you a job at a restaurant in Miami, this happens all the time. You come and you take the job, and then you find out that they're keeping your papers, they're not paying you.
Mhm.
And again, it's how we treat people. We make them vulnerable, and then we tell them that they're on their own.
When there's a regulation written, there's someone already thinking of a way to usurp it or use it to their advantage to exploit it. And that's all that is. those laws are nothing. Everything's fallible. There's always ways around and
Right.
through and
Right.
everything, so.
And, it's, this is like preaching to the choir, but everyone digs in when they're wrong instead of adjusting course. And like what I always want to say to the entrapment model folks, or there's nobody really talking about prostitution related form that's like anyone who's really talking about it, it's either entrapment model or decriminalization. Nobody's like really pushing for legalization. And when I say this conversation, it's happening in the states where there's any kind of discussion away from criminalization. But I just, I lost what I wanted. I lost my train
No
of thought.
worries. It's been a long day. You, yeah. The
There
adjustment
was one
model,
thing
something about the model.
oh yeah, I don't, but it was something, so basic about, like, just as another example, we see all the time, this advocate for the entrapment model, who is a human rights lawyer, cares deeply about people, clearly, who she talks about the foster care to prostitution pipeline. This is an example of indicting the wrong issue. So we all know that foster care in this system is horrible for a number of reasons. And children end up at 16, 17, 18 out on their own on the streets with no resources, no support. It's not surprising that a number of them involved, end up in being exploited because of those vulnerabilities. But in these hearings, all we hear over and over again is indict prostitution, right? The foster care to prostitution pipeline. So prostitution is the issue. Well, guys, why are we not looking at the root causes? If you care so much about trafficking, let's stop punishing everyone for it. And let's spend the time and energy reforming the foster care system, looking at these vulnerabilities. Like, if you actually want to help, like, what are you doing here opposing this? And it comes down to this baseline idea they have that sex work is inherently exploitative, and that's just not true.
I agree with all of that assessment. So, Ariela, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any final words? Anything you'd like to
I
share? I'm
mean,
sure we'll share some
so
show notes and everything.
so many, always, but I appreciate your interest in the topic. People ask me all the time if they're interested in joining us in the fight for decriminalization, how they can do that. And so there's a couple really simple ways, a couple concrete ways are to talk to your legislators and electeds and let them know your concerns if you have them. But a really simple thing people can do anywhere, anytime, is to challenge the narrative that you consistently hear about sex workers. When you hear somebody use derogatory language, when, whatever it may be, it does matter to remind people that sex workers are human and that they have agency and that there's choice involved. Because when, the entrapment model proponents tell everyone that there's no agency involved because it's inherently exploitative, they continue to send the message that these aren't human beings engaged in it. And it's so dehumanizing to hear the way they talk about it. And again, I know we're trying to wrap up, but you use the word supply and demand because they have this end demand notion. It's just another example of, they talk about bodies being sold. The body is the commodity. Well, people aren't selling their bodies. They're selling a service. But the same people who keep saying you're selling your body are also talking about supply and demand. We're we're not. So just there's a humanistic issue there that I think we all need to keep in mind.
Well, thank you again for joining. You are now official member of the Not Conscious family. Ariela
Glad
Moscowitz,
to be
Director of
a part of it.
Communications for Decriminalize Sex Work. It's decriminalizesex.work. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you so much, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you again. It was great meeting your team and everything. And like I said, I'm just here to push the Overton women towards some kind of liberty. Everyone should take it just a step back at everything in their lives and just think about it. does the end result, does the sex work affect you as a human being? The trafficking, we know hurts someone. We know that's not a good, we clearly know that, but laws are already in place for that. But do these things happen? Does someone smoking marijuana in their bedroom affect you? Does someone engaging two consensual people or more consensual people engaging in some act? How does that affect you personally? And take a step back. The truth is, it might offend you, but it doesn't affect you. And I
And
think
it
that's a good way to
shouldn't
look
offend you
at
to
life.
the level that you feel like they should suffer and be exposed to
Right.
violence because it wouldn't be your choice.
For
So
sure.
that's,
Exactly. So thank you again. I'm going
thank
to hit
you.
stop here, but it's been great meeting you. Please don't go
Keep in
anywhere
touch.
just in case, because we had that little technical hiccup. I want to make sure we get it. So thank you again, Ariela. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day. Take care. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. I hate to leave you, but I really must say, good night, sweetheart. Good night.